The year is 1943. You're a young American soldier crouched in a foxhole somewhere in the Pacific. The jungle is dead silent except for the sound of your own heartbeat pounding in your ears. Then you hear it, a low, mechanical hiss cutting through the humid air. Your blood runs cold because you know exactly what that sound means. But here's what most people don't realize about this weapon that would soon be banned from warfare forever. It wasn't banned because of how many people it killed. It was banned because of what it did to the human mind. And today, I'm going to tell you the complete story of the weapon that terrified entire armies and changed the rules of war itself. I've been studying the forgotten weapons and untold stories of World War II. What you're about to hear isn't just another war story. This is the story of how a single weapon became so psychologically devastating that the world's military leaders said, "Never again." We're talking about the flamethrower, but not just any flamethrower. We're talking about the German Flammenwerfer 35 and its successors, weapons so terrifying that hardened combat veterans would abandon their positions at the mere sight of them. Now you might be thinking, it's just fire, right? Soldiers have been using fire in warfare for thousands of years. But you'd be wrong, because what the Germans perfected in the 1940s wasn't just a weapon. It was a psychological warfare tool that could break the will of an entire unit without firing a single shot. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why this weapon was so feared that it had to be banned from warfare forever. Let me take you back to 1901. A German engineer named Richard Fiedler is sitting in his workshop, frustrated by the limitations of traditional warfare. Trenches, machine guns, artillery, everything had become about distance. But Fiedler had a different idea. What if you could bring the fight up close and personal? Fiedler's first flamethrower was crude, basically a backpack tank connected to a nozzle. But it worked. The German military took notice, and by World War I, they were using these weapons in the trenches of the Western Front. But here's where it gets interesting. The early flamethrowers weren't particularly effective as killing machines. They had a range of only about 20 yards, they were heavy, and they made the operator a prime target. So why did the Germans keep developing them? Because they discovered something unexpected. When Allied soldiers saw that stream of fire coming toward their trench, something broke inside them. Hardened veterans who had survived months of artillery bombardment would throw down their rifles and run. It wasn't the fire itself. It was the primal, prehistoric fear that fire triggers in the human brain. By the 1930s, German engineers had learned this lesson well. They weren't just building a better flamethrower, they were building a fear machine. And when World War II began, they had perfected it. The Flammenwerfer 35 could shoot a stream of burning fuel 25 meters. That's about 80 feet. But more importantly, it could do something that no other weapon could do. It could clear an entire bunker system without the defenders firing a single shot in return. Now, let me explain exactly how this weapon worked, because understanding the mechanics helps you understand the psychology. The Flammenwerfer 35 consisted of two tanks, one filled with fuel, the other with compressed nitrogen. When the operator pulled the trigger, the nitrogen forced the fuel through a nozzle where it was ignited by a small pilot light. The result was a stream of burning liquid that could reach temperatures of over 1,000 degrees Celsius. But here's the crucial detail that made it so effective. It wasn't just fire. The fuel was a sticky, gel-like substance that would cling to whatever it hit. Concrete, metal, human skin, it didn't matter. Once that fuel made contact, it kept burning. German combat reports from the Eastern Front tell us exactly how devastating this was. A single flamethrower operator could clear a Soviet bunker complex that might have taken hours of conventional assault to capture. Not because he killed everyone inside, but because the defenders would abandon their positions the moment they saw that stream of fire. Lieutenant Hans Müller of the 3rd Panzer Division wrote in his diary, "The Russians are brave fighters. They will hold their positions against tanks, artillery, even dive bombers." But when they see the Flammenwerfer, they run, every time. The weapon was so effective that by 1942, every German assault engineer unit was equipped with flamethrowers. They became standard equipment for urban warfare, bunker clearing, and trench assaults. But the Germans weren't the only ones who recognized the weapon's potential. The Americans developed their own versions, the M1 and M2 flamethrowers. The British had the AK-Pak. The Soviets created the ROX series. By 1943, every major military power was fielding flamethrower units. And that's when the real horror began. Here's what the military strategists of the 1940s discovered about human psychology. There are certain fears that bypass rational thought entirely. The fear of fire is one of them. Dr. James Patterson, a U.S. Army psychiatrist who studied combat stress during World War II, wrote, "A soldier can be trained to face bullets, shells, even poison gas. But fire triggers something deeper, something primitive. When a man sees that flame coming toward him, his training disappears. His courage disappears. He becomes an animal trying to escape." This wasn't just theory. It was documented fact. American forces in the Pacific discovered that Japanese soldiers, men who would fight to the death rather than surrender, would abandon fortified positions when faced with flamethrowers. These were the same soldiers who had held out against weeks of bombardment, who had launched suicidal banzai charges against overwhelming odds. But when they saw that stream of fire, they ran. The psychological impact went beyond just the immediate target. Word spread through enemy units about what these weapons could do. Entire companies would retreat at the rumor that flamethrower units were in the area. General Curtis LeMay, who commanded bombing operations in the Pacific, noted, "We could drop thousands of tons of bombs on a Japanese position, and they'd keep fighting. But send in a few guys with flamethrowers, and suddenly they'd start surrendering." But here's where the story takes a dark turn. Military commanders on all sides began to realize that the flamethrower's true power wasn't as a weapon of war. It was as a weapon of terror. German SS units began using flamethrowers not just against military targets, but against civilian populations. The weapon that had been designed for bunker clearing was being used to terrorize entire villages. Allied forces weren't innocent either. American flamethrower units in the Pacific began using their weapons in ways that went far beyond military necessity. The line between warfare and terrorism was becoming blurred, and that's when the international community said, "Enough." The year is 1949. World War II has been over for 4 years, but the memories of what flamethrowers could do are still fresh in everyone's minds. Diplomats from around the world are gathering in Geneva, Switzerland, for a very specific purpose. They're here to make sure that what happened with flamethrowers never happens again. The Geneva Convention of 1949 didn't just address the treatment of prisoners of war or the protection of civilians. It specifically addressed weapons that were deemed to cause unnecessary suffering. And at the top of that list was the flamethrower. But here's what's fascinating about the debate that led to this decision. It wasn't the physical damage that concerned the diplomats most. It was the psychological damage. British delegate Sir Winston Churchill argued, "A weapon that destroys a man's will to fight before it destroys his body is not a weapon of war. It is an instrument of terror, and terror has no place on the battlefield." The American delegation presented evidence from their own military psychiatrists. Soldiers who had faced flamethrowers, even those who had escaped unharmed, showed rates of combat stress reaction that were 3 times higher than soldiers who had faced conventional weapons. The weapon wasn't just killing bodies, it was killing minds. The Soviet delegation, despite having used flamethrowers extensively on the Eastern Front, supported the ban. Marshal Georgy Zhukov stated, "A weapon that makes cowards of brave men serves no military purpose. It serves only to spread fear." On August 12, 1949, the Geneva Convention Protocol 3 was signed by 48 nations. It prohibited the use of incendiary weapons against military targets in populated areas and banned their use against civilian populations entirely. The flamethrower, the weapon that had terrified entire armies, was officially banned from warfare. But the story doesn't end there. Today, more than 75 years after the flamethrower was banned, military psychologists still study its impact. Not because they want to bring it back, but because they want to understand how weapons can affect the human mind. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a modern military psychologist, explains, "The flamethrower taught us that the most dangerous weapons aren't necessarily the ones that kill the most people. They're the ones that break the human spirit. And once you break that spirit, you've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed." The lessons learned from the flamethrower have influenced modern military doctrine in ways most people don't realize. Rules of engagement, weapons development, even the design of military training. All of it has been shaped by what we learned about psychological warfare in the 1940s. But perhaps the most important legacy of the flamethrower ban is what it represents: the recognition that some weapons are simply too terrible to use, regardless of their military effectiveness. In an age where we have weapons that can level entire cities, the flamethrower reminds us that sometimes the most frightening weapons are the ones that get up close and personal, the ones that force us to confront our most primal fears. The German Flammenwerfer, 35, and its variants killed thousands of soldiers during World War II. But its true impact was measured not in deaths, but in the terror it spread through the ranks of every army that faced it. It was a weapon so effective at breaking the human will that the world decided it had no place in civilized warfare. And that decision, made in a conference room in Geneva in 1949, stands to this day. The flamethrower was banned not because it was the deadliest weapon of World War II. It wasn't. It was banned because it revealed something uncomfortable about human nature: that there are fears so deep, so primal, that they can override years of military training in an instant. The men who faced these weapons weren't cowards. They were soldiers who had proven their courage in countless battles. But when confronted with that stream of fire, something deeper than courage took over. Something that reminded them they were still, fundamentally, human. And perhaps that's the real lesson of the flamethrower, that in our rush to create more effective weapons, we must never forget the human cost of warfare. Not just the physical cost, but the psychological cost. The weapon that terrified entire armies taught us that some victories aren't worth winning. Some weapons are too terrible to use, and some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. That's why the flamethrower was banned forever, and that's why it should stay that way. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, you'll definitely want to check out the other videos I've recommended on your screen. Each one explores another forgotten weapon or untold story from history that changed the course of warfare forever. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.